I was born in a small Ukrainian village in 1936, in the middle of a famine. Death was no stranger to me. Corpses piled up in the streets, victims of hunger and despair. But the most terrifying thing was not only the hunger, but the story my mother told me when I was a little boy, as she cradled me in her lap.
Your older brother has been kidnapped and eaten by peasants.
The authorities closed their eyes, convinced that serial killers only existed in capitalism. I, Andrei Chikatilo, was the proof of their mistake. I was born on October 16, 1936 in the then Soviet Republic of Ukraine during World War II. I grew up in a family of extreme poverty. My mother was a strict and controlling woman. She humiliated me and blamed me for family difficulties. My father was a prisoner of war and had no influence on my life. From a very young age, I felt different. At school, I was reserved, almost invisible. It was hard for me to accept that I had vision problems, and out of pride or shame, I didn't wear glasses until I turned 30. During childhood, I also dragged other complexes. Until I was 12 years old, I was still wetting the bed, and that only made things worse.
Я не знаю, любил или нет, я ее не имел, никто не ласкал. Никто никогда не ласкал, никогда, потому что у нас как раз все мое детство пришло, это на военные, на голодные годы, так что мы там только лишь бы пухлые ходили, лежали бы выжить, какие там ласки.
I was constantly teased by my classmates. I wouldn't say anything. I would just put my head down and put up with it. Every word, every humiliation was being stored, like drops in a glass that was slowly filling up. Over time, I became even more shy, especially with women, to the point that my first attempt at an intimate relationship failed. This gave rise to the first rumors about my impotence. The reality is that I suffered from erectile dysfunction, something that marked me deeply and affected my way of relating to others. I did my military service, like everyone else in the Soviet Union, and then concentrated on studying.
Не увлекает, понимаете? Меня вот это общественно-политически все увлекает. Я вот восхищался философией марксистско-ленинской, как все там стройно и как все логично, все три источника, три составные части марксизма-ленинизма, я все это изучал, я конспектировал, все 55 томов Ленина проштудировал, 4 университета марксизма-ленинизма закончил в разных городах, разные факультеты международных отношений, и пропагандистский, и пархозактива, там, и все это самое, разные факультеты, все.
I became a teacher in 1971. On the surface, everything seemed to be going well. But inside, things were different. There were thoughts I could not control. I tried hard to repress them. I took refuge in the ideas of communism, seeking in discipline a way to order myself inside. But what for others was ideology, for me became a refuge, almost an obsession. Despite my limitations, I managed to raise a family with my wife. We had 2 children, Lyudmila and Yuri. It was necessary to resort to unconventional methods in order to conceive. I tried to be a good husband, responsible, hardworking. At home I was calm. At work and in the Communist Party, I earned a reputation as a serious, committed man. I lived with the sobriety expected of any exemplary Soviet citizen. At the school where I worked, I was constantly teased by the students. They nicknamed me the Goose because of my stooped posture and elongated neck. They physically assaulted me, pushed me, humiliated me, and I, just like when I was a child, said nothing. In the late 1970s, something in me changed. It was as if everything I had repressed for so long began to overflow. One day in December 1978, I approached a little girl on the street. She was only 9 years old. I spoke to her kindly, as a teacher would. As a parent would. I took her to a hut on the outskirts. And there something happened that marked a before and after in my life. A few days after the incident with that girl, the police found her remains in a nearby river. They also discovered a large bloodstain around the cabin. I was questioned, but I was not charged. Another man was charged, Alexander Kravchenko, someone with a record. I, on the other hand, went unnoticed. After all, I was the exemplary citizen. The first crimes were not entirely planned. I even thought that maybe he was just looking for some kind of connection, something physical, even if it was fleeting. But what really struck me was the terror in the victim's eyes awakened something in me. And it was then that I realized that, for me, the violent act itself had become the only way to achieve what others found in love. The victims were usually children, teenagers, vulnerable young people. Some had run away from home. Others didn't quite understand the world around them. They were easy to convince. My appearance was completely harmless, almost weak. The children looked at me and saw not danger, but a friendly, perhaps even paternal figure. I would approach them with any excuse, a promise of help, a friendly conversation. And little by little I managed to get them to accompany me to secluded, wooded areas, far from the noise of the city. There, the real horror began. The scenes I was leaving behind were so disturbing and accurate that investigators began to suspect medical professionals, even surgeons. No one thought a simple teacher could be responsible. Eventually, I discovered that there were parts of the body that I found particularly attractive. I confessed it later, and I even consumed some parts, as if that made me keep something I couldn't get any other way. In 1981, I got a job as a supply officer for a factory. I had to travel constantly throughout the region, which gave me the perfect cover. No one is suspicious of someone who seems to be always doing his duty. On September 3rd of that year, I was active again. The second victim? In the forest. I lost control. After committing the act, I was overcome by a surge of emotions so intense that I found myself howling, dancing in circles as if I were part of a primitive ritual. At that moment, I knew I wasn't going to stop. What I had started would be repeated, and so it did. Investigators worked tirelessly. In Moscow, the 𝗶𝗵𝗍𝗍 Institute, through forensic evidence, drew a profile that seemed solid.
Married man, normal appearance, stable employment. The perpetrator has blood group AB.
On September 14th, 1984, I was arrested. I was found loitering in the Rostov market. But the blood test did not match. Mine was Group A. That was enough to rule me out. I was released without charge. I returned home. And the horror continued. By then, the police had already investigated more than 26,000 suspects. And yet, I was still free, hiding in plain sight. The newspapers were already openly talking about a serial killer. On October 17, 1990, I was active again. This time in a forest near the Donlezhsk station. The crime activated the entire local police force. They even mobilized a riot unit of 100 men, but that didn't stop me. Just 2 weeks later, I did it again. Now there were 600 detectives involved in the search. The most isolated train stations were under constant surveillance. On November 6th, Sergeant Igor Rybakov saw me coming out of the forest. I approached a fountain to wash my hands. He stopped me, asked for my documents, and wrote a routine report. Nothing more. 5 days later, in the same place, another body was found. According to forensics, the death had occurred just a week earlier. That meant that the killer had passed by exactly when that sergeant saw me. There was no longer any doubt. On November 20th, 1990, the arrest warrant became effective. I was accused of having murdered 36 people. Women, children. The evidence was beginning to fit. Although my blood was Group A, my genetic fingerprint was not. The sperm was a match. Group AB. That day, when the KGB intercepted me, I remember I could hardly react. I was walking slowly. I felt weak. I told them, "How can you do this to someone my age?" But they would no longer listen to excuses. In the first interrogations, I said that I was just another citizen and that this was an absurd persecution. But on November 27th, exhausted by the interrogations, I offered to collaborate. 2 days later, I confessed one by one to 53 murders. One of them was on May 25, 1984, when I met Tatiana Petrosian, 29, and her daughter Svetlana, 10. Tatiana had known me for several years. Taking advantage of this relationship, I managed to convince them to accompany me to a nearby forest. Once in the forest, Svetlana witnessed her mother's murder and fled in terror. I chased her for almost half a kilometer before catching up with her and ending her life. The bodies of both were discovered weeks later in a wooded area. I guided the investigators through the places where all the crimes had occurred. I wrote a signed statement to the Attorney General, which read, "I am in a state of deep depression, and I recognize that I have disturbed sexual impulses, which is why I have committed certain acts. I have previously sought psychiatric help, but the treatments were unsuccessful. In my school days, I was bloated because of hunger. Everyone picked on me. At school, I studied so hard that sometimes I lost consciousness and fainted. I wanted to prove myself at work, and I gave my all. People valued me, but took advantage of my weak character. Now that I am older, my problems are all mental. In sexual acts, I experience a kind of rage, a feeling of being unrestrained. I could not control my actions. What I did was not for sexual pleasure, but because it gave me a certain peace of mind and soul for long periods." The psychiatrists at the 𝗶𝗶𝗏 Institute did not see in me a sick person, but someone who knew perfectly well what he was doing. They said I was fully aware of my actions. My trial began in April 1992. I was presented to the court as a defeated man, head shaved, isolated inside a metal cage. At first, I tried to attract attention, to create confusion, to pretend to be out of control. But as the days passed, the silence grew heavier. There was nothing that could change what was already done. After months of testimony and evidence, the judges announced the verdict. I was sentenced to death. That was the end of it for me. For years, I lived between two worlds. In one, I was a father, a husband, a comrade. In the other, nobody. I sought to satisfy my innermost desires in the hope of feeling like everyone else, but I didn't succeed. Why didn't the people around me realize what was happening? If you liked this video, like it and subscribe for more shocking crime and mystery content. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. He moved with his girlfriend to a quiet village in Ukraine. However, Anatoly Onoprienko could not escape the disturbing voices in his mind. His uncontrolled brutality unleashed the most intense manhunt in Ukrainian history. Despite police efforts, they failed to apprehend the infamous killer known as the Butcher. Why? The answer is in the following video. Never turn off the light.